I am Gabrielle, and at 30 years old, I achieved what my wealthy Atlanta family considered impossible. For their biggest disappointment, I built a financial technology empire completely under their radar. During my master degree graduation dinner at an exclusive Buckhead restaurant, I smiled politely while my family humiliated me. What they did not know was that 48 hours earlier, I had quietly transferred my entire multi-million-dollar inheritance from my grandparents into an irrevocable trust, just as a precaution. When my father smugly announced he had sold my historic property behind my back to my arrogant brother-in-law, I simply paid the dinner tab and walked away. They thought they had destroyed me. They had no idea they had just walked into a trap of their own making. Before I share exactly how I legally dismantled their perfect high society facade, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how real generational wealth protects itself. Growing up in the elite circles of Black Atlanta meant appearances were everything. My mother Valerie spent her days maintaining her flawless reputation in her prestigious sorority and elite social clubs. My father, Reginald, was a real estate developer who cared more about his image at the country club than his actual bank balance. Then there was my younger sister, Jasmine. She was the golden child who could do no wrong. Jasmine ran a luxury lifestyle brand that bled money while my parents eagerly covered her losses. Her white husband, Connor, was a fast-talking cryptocurrency investor who constantly bragged about his phantom wealth. I was the family scapegoat. I chose coding over debutante balls and late-night programming over networking galas. Tonight was supposed to be my night. We were sitting in a private dining room at one of the most expensive Buckhead restaurants. The crystal chandeliers reflected off the imported marble tables, and the waitstaff hovered invisibly in the corners. We were ostensibly there to celebrate me earning my master's degree in computer science. But as the dessert plates were cleared, my mother Valerie stood up and tapped her crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. "I would like to make a toast to the real stars of the evening," my mother announced, her voice carrying the practiced projection of a seasoned socialite. "To Jasmine and Connor on their beautiful new $150,000 G-Wagon. You two are building such an incredible life together, and your father and I are so incredibly proud of the power couple you have become. Cheers to the future." My father raised his glass, beaming with pride at Jasmine, who batted her eyelashes with practiced false modesty. Connor smirked, pulling at the cuffs of his flashy designer suit. Not a single word was spoken about my graduation. Not a single acknowledgement of the degree I had spent 3 grueling years earning while running my tech company in secret. I sat quietly next to my boyfriend, Elijah, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. Then the waiter approached our table carrying a heavy black leather folder. He stepped toward my father, but Connor suddenly reached out and snatched it from the hands of the waiter. Connor flipped the folder open, glanced at the total, and let out a sharp laugh. He casually tossed the leather folder across the table. It landed squarely in my lap. "Well, Gabrielle," Connor said, leaning back in his chair with an arrogant grin. "Since you finally got a piece of paper today and the family has fed you long enough, I think it is time you handled the check. Consider it a thank you to your parents for putting up with you all these years." I looked down at the receipt. The total was $4,500. They had ordered vintage champagne, imported caviar, and the most expensive Wagyu steaks on the menu. The room grew deathly quiet. Jasmine let out a small, cruel giggle. My mother simply adjusted her diamond necklace, pretending not to notice the sheer audacity of her son-in-law, demanding I pay for a celebration they had hijacked. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed my hand over the leather folder and looked directly into the eyes of Connor. "That is a fascinating perspective, Connor," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "But let us be clear about who is feeding. Who? My parents have not paid for a single meal, a single textbook, or a single month of my rent. Since the day I turned 18, I paid for my own undergraduate degree, and I paid for the master degree. We are supposed to be celebrating tonight." I turned my gaze to my mother, who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Mom, you and Dad just wired Jasmine the entire $75,000 down payment for that G-Wagon you just toasted, so please do not insult my intelligence by pretending anyone at this table has been supporting me. The silence that followed was suffocating. The smug expression of Jasmine vanished, replaced by an ugly scowl. The face of Connor turned a violent shade of red as he opened his mouth to argue, but my father beat him to it. Reginald slammed his fist onto the marble table, making the crystal glasses rattle dangerously. "You ungrateful little brat!" My father hissed, his voice shaking with absolute rage. "How dare you speak to your family that way, after everything I just did to save us? You think you are so smart with your little degree? Well, I have news for you. I just fixed the biggest mistake your grandparents ever made, and you have absolutely no say in the matter. I sold that useless downtown building of yours directly to the investment firm of Connor today. Your precious inheritance belongs to us now." I smiled. The truth meant pure victory. My father leaned forward, his expensive cologne. Failing to mask the desperation sweating out of his pores, he announced to the entire table that he had taken matters into his own hands to save our family from financial ruin caused by ungrateful children. He stared directly at me as he said it, making sure everyone in the private dining room understood exactly who he was blaming for his own chronic mismanagement of funds. He declared that he had sold the historic downtown commercial building, the exact building my grandparents had left entirely to me in their will. I sat perfectly still, letting his words hang in the air. The heavy silence was broken by Connor, who puffed out his chest and adjusted his designer tie. My brother-in-law proudly revealed that his investment firm was the buyer, and they had closed the deal for $3 million. He boasted about his grand plans to demolish the legacy of my grandparents and erect a sterile luxury condominium complex in its place. He described the modern glass facades and the rooftop pools he planned to build, wiping away decades of my family history to line his own pockets. My mother, Valerie, immediately chimed in to support them, clapping her hands together as if they had just won the lottery. She called it a brilliant business move, her voice dripping with that familiar condescension she had perfected over the years. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain, stating that someone like me, just a struggling student drowning in tuition debt, would never know what to do with such a prime piece of real estate. Anyway, she said it was a burden lifted from my shoulders, and that I should be thanking my father and my brother-in-law for taking such a massive responsibility off my plate. Jasmine nodded along, sipping her champagne and adding that I could barely manage my own life, let alone a commercial property. She said the adults in the family needed to step in and make the hard choices to keep our status in the community intact. They all spoke about my property, my inheritance, as if I were a toddler who had accidentally wandered into a boardroom. They justified their theft by wrapping it in the guise of familial duty and financial wisdom, playing the roles of the responsible caretakers while picking my pockets clean. Then came the ultimate insult. My father reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp piece of paper. He slid it across the marble table. It stopped right next to the leather folder containing the dinner bill. I looked down and saw a check made out to me for $50,000. My father leaned back, crossing his arms with a look of absolute self-satisfaction. He told me that was my cut of the sale. He said I could finally pay off my student loans, or maybe buy myself a reliable used car. He told me to take the money and be grateful because he did not have to give me a single dime of it. He spoke as if he were bestowing a grand charitable grant upon a beggar, rather than handing me a tiny fraction of the money he had stolen from my rightful inheritance. $50,000 out of a $3 million sale of a property that belonged entirely to me. He was offering me crumbs from the theft of my own legacy while acting like a generous benefactor. I looked at the check, and then I looked at the faces of my family. My mother with her expectant, polite smile, waiting for my gratitude. My sister looking slightly jealous that I was even getting $50,000. My brother-in-law looking like he had just conquered the world, and my father waiting for me to bow my head and accept his scraps. They were all so convinced of their own superiority, so certain that they had outsmarted the family disappointment. Elijah sat beside me, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, observing the entire spectacle. He knew exactly what I knew. But he let me take the lead. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not beg them to reverse the sale or threaten to call the police. The years of conditioning, where I would have broken down and asked why they hated me so much, were completely gone. I felt nothing but a cold, calculating clarity rushing through my veins. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my heavy metal black American Express card. I dropped it directly onto the $4,500 dinner bill in the leather folder. The satisfying thud of the solid metal card hitting the table made my mother blink in confusion, her eyes darting from the card to my face. I did not even glance at the $50,000 check my father had slid across to me. I left it sitting there on the marble, a pathetic symbol of their greed and their ignorance. I pushed my chair back and stood up, smoothing the fabric of my dress. Elijah stood up beside me, offering his arm. I looked down at Connor, who was staring at my black Amex with a sudden flicker of confusion, breaking through his arrogant facade. He could not compute how the struggling student possessed a card that required millions in assets to even acquire. I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face, a smile that held all the secrets they were too blind to see. I leaned in slightly, resting my hands on the edge of the table, and whispered that he had bought the building. I told him, "Congratulations." Connor and I wished him the best of luck with his new $3 million investment. The words tasted sweet, leaving my lips dripping with an irony none of them could comprehend yet. I turned and walked out of the private dining room with Elijah, leaving the $50,000 check sitting untouched next to my metal credit card. I could feel their eyes burning into my back as we walked down the corridor and out into the warm Atlanta night. They thought they had just pulled off the heist of the century. They thought they had stolen my future to fund their lavish lifestyles and cover their hidden debts. They had no idea that they had just handed $3 million of borrowed money for a piece of paper that meant absolutely nothing. And the fallout was going to be spectacular. We stepped out of the heavy air conditioning of the restaurant and into the thick, humid Atlanta evening. The valet brought our car around a sleek, customized sedan that I kept parked blocks away, whenever I visited my parents to keep up the illusion. Elijah opened the passenger door for me, and I sank into the leather seats, letting out a long breath the moment the doors closed and the engine purred to life. The timid, struggling student persona I had worn all evening melted away completely. I leaned my head against the headrest and let out a genuine laugh, a sound of pure disbelief at the sheer audacity of what had just happened inside that private dining room. Elijah navigated the car out of the valet line, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel. He glanced over at me with a sharp, knowing smile playing on his lips. He asked me if my father honestly believed he had just gotten away with the real estate heist of the century. He asked if Reginald actually thought he could just forge his way through a commercial property sale without any legal blowback. I shook my head, looking out the window at the passing city lights, watching the expensive boutiques and high-end restaurants blur past us. I told Elijah that my father had always been blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to maintain his country club lifestyle. I reminded Elijah of what we had discovered just 48 hours ago. My security team at the fintech firm had flagged a suspicious inquiry on my credit and background. A routine check triggered by a title company downtown. We had dug into it and found out that Reginald was quietly shopping the deed to the historic building my grandparents had left me. He was waving around an outdated and legally revoked power of attorney from when I was 18 years old, back when he convinced me he needed it to manage my student loans. Elijah nodded, his eyes focused on the road as we merged onto the highway. He had been the one to draft the emergency documents the minute we uncovered my father and his desperate plot. Elijah, being the brilliant corporate attorney that he is, knew exactly how to block the fraudulent sale before the ink could even dry on whatever illegal contract my father was drawing up with Connor. We had spent the entire night locked in his office, transferring the deed of the historic property directly into a bulletproof, irrevocable trust. A trust in the name of my grandparents, where I was the sole beneficiary and the absolute controlling trustee. The moment that filing was stamped by the county clerk, the revoked power of attorney my father held became nothing more than a worthless piece of scrap paper. I looked at the dashboard display, watching the digital numbers shift, and thought about the absolute joke of a price they had agreed upon. $3 million. Connor had strutted around that restaurant table, bragging about spending $3 million on a building he planned to demolish. They were both so blinded by their greed and their shared superiority complex that neither of them had bothered to do a proper zoning analysis or an updated commercial appraisal. The building was not worth $3 million. It was sitting on prime downtown real estate that had just quietly been rezoned for high-density residential high-rises. The actual market value of the dirt alone was $15 million, and developers were already circling like sharks. The tragic comedy of it all was that Reginald thought he had swindled me out of a forgotten, decaying warehouse, while Connor thought he had manipulated his father-in-law into handing over a gold mine for pennies on the dollar. Neither of them realized that the legal transfer they had supposedly executed earlier that day was completely void. The sale was a phantom transaction, an illegal fantasy. But the real catastrophe, the absolute masterpiece of this entire disaster, was that Connor had already wired the $3 million in cold hard cash directly into the personal bank account of my father, Elijah. Tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, his expression growing slightly more serious. As we drove deeper into the city, he warned me that this was going to get ugly. Very quickly, he had run a background check on the investment firm Connor constantly bragged about and discovered that it was mostly smoke and mirrors. Connor was heavily leveraged, borrowing money against phantom assets and scrambling to keep his flashy lifestyle afloat. Elijah told me that the $3 million Connor had just wired to my father was likely not his own money. It was probably borrowed from highly impatient and extremely dangerous shadow lenders who expected an immediate return on their investment. Elijah asked me what my next move was going to be, asking if we should have his law firm send a cease and desist letter or notify the authorities about the fraudulent wire transfer before the money was entirely spent. I looked at the glowing skyline of Atlanta rising up before us, the city where my family cared more about their social standing than their own flesh and blood. I thought about the $50,000 check my father had thrown at me like a dog begging for scraps, and the smug face of my mother praising the men who were robbing me blind. The thought of Jasmine spending the borrowed millions of her husband on useless luxury items made me smile. She had always looked down on me, thinking her brand-new luxury cars and designer handbags made her better than the sister who supposedly could barely afford a decent meal. She had mocked my education and my quiet lifestyle, never realizing that stealth wealth was the only way to survive in a family obsessed with taking from others. Elijah shifted the car into a higher gear, smoothly passing the slower traffic, and told me I had ice in my veins. He said he had never seen anyone remain so composed while their own flesh and blood attempted to steal their future. Right in front of them, I replied that you can only be hurt by people you actually value, and my family had lost their value to me a long time ago. The moment Reginald forged that paperwork, he ceased being my father and became just another greedy criminal, making a fatal business error. The city lights reflected in the dark-tinted windows of the car as we drove on, and I felt a deep sense of peace settling over me. I told Elijah to do absolutely nothing. I told him we were going to sit back and watch them celebrate their fake victory. I knew my parents. They would start burning through that $3 million by sunrise, buying designer clothes, throwing parties, and showing off for their elite friends, and Connor would start acting like a real estate mogul, borrowing even more money against a property he did not own. They had built their own trap. They had loaded it with their own greed, and they had handed me the detonator. I told Elijah we were going to stay completely silent and let them dig their own graves. The very next morning, before the Atlanta sun had even fully risen over the skyline, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Elijah had set up an alert system tied directly to the security cameras surrounding my grandparents' historic downtown building. The notification was simple, but it told me everything I needed to know. Motion detected at the main gate. I rolled over and tapped the screen, watching the live feed load in high definition. There stood Connor pacing back and forth in a bright yellow hard hat and a high-visibility vest, worn over a ridiculously expensive designer polo shirt. Behind him, idling aggressively in the street, were two massive yellow bulldozers and a crew of demolition workers drinking coffee from paper cups. Connor was pointing at my legacy, shouting orders, as if he were a seasoned developer rather than a glorified crypto bro, playing with borrowed mafia money. He was eager to knock down generations of my family history, to build his sterile luxury condos, and erase my grandparents from the map. I got out of bed and dressed calmly, opting for a simple, tailored black suit that screamed quiet authority rather than flashy wealth. Elijah met me in the kitchen, already off the phone with the local precinct. He told me the police were on their way and would meet us at the property line. We drove downtown in silence, the morning traffic still light, the air cool and crisp when we pulled up to the curb. The heavy diesel engines of the bulldozers were roaring, shaking the pavement beneath our feet. Connor saw my car approach, and a massive, arrogant grin spread across his face. He genuinely thought I had rushed down there to throw myself in front of the machines to cry and beg him to spare my childhood memories. He squared his shoulders and walked toward me as I stepped out of the vehicle, the two Atlanta police officers pulling up right behind us, their cruiser lights flashing silently in the early morning shadow of the building. Connor did not even wait for the officers to approach. He immediately reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers, waving them in the air like a victory flag. He looked at me and laughed, a sharp, condescending sound that echoed against the brick walls of my building. He told me I was too late and that I should just go back to my little student apartment. He proudly announced to the police officers that he was the legal owner of the property, holding up the fake contract my father had signed just yesterday. He mocked me openly, telling the officers that I was just a disgruntled daughter, throwing a tantrum because my father finally let a real man handle the family business. He boasted that real estate development was not a game for little girls, and that I should stand back and watch how actual wealth is built by people who know what they are doing. He strutted around the sidewalk, acting as if the mere presence of his rented construction equipment proved his dominance over me and my inheritance. The police officers looked at the paperwork and then looked at me, their expressions neutral but cautious. They asked if there was a dispute over the ownership, and Connor immediately interrupted, claiming there was no dispute at all. He said he had wired $3 million to my father, and the deed was his. He tapped the forged signature of Reginald on the contract, acting as if it were an impenetrable shield against any legal challenge. I did not raise my voice, and I did not argue with his delusions. I simply stepped forward and handed the lead officer a certified copy of the irrevocable trust documents, proving the property belonged to a protected legal entity that I solely controlled. The officer reviewed the watermarked pages, comparing them to the outdated power of attorney Connor was waving around. I did not ask the police to arrest him or to shut down his entire operation. Right then and there, I told the officers that I was not here to start a physical altercation with a man who clearly did not understand basic property law or corporate governance. I turned to the police and calmly stated that I merely wanted to file a formal trespassing report against Connor and his demolition company. I wanted it officially documented in the police database that he had brought heavy machinery onto my private property without legal authorization, and that he had attempted to initiate an unlawful demolition. The officers nodded, taking notes and filling out the necessary paperwork on the hood of their cruiser. Connor stood there, his smug smile faltering for just a fraction of a second as confusion washed over his pale face. He looked from the police to me, unable to comprehend why I was not screaming or fighting tooth and nail to halt the bulldozers. He asked me what I was playing at, his voice dropping its arrogant bravado. For a brief moment, he told me a trespassing report was a joke, and that it would not stop him from tearing the place down by noon. He insisted that my trust documents were fake and that his investment firm was going to steamroll my pathetic attempts to hold onto a ruined piece of brick and mortar. I looked Connor dead in the eyes and maintained my perfectly calm demeanor, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him shift uncomfortably on his feet. I told him I was not trying to fight him today. I told him I simply wanted it on the official legal record that he had stepped foot on this property on this specific date and claimed ownership of it. I let a faint smile touch my lips, leaving him utterly confused, but entirely too arrogant to realize he had just been boxed into an inescapable corner. I turned and walked back to my car with Elijah, the police officers informing Connor that until the conflicting paperwork was sorted out in a civil court, the bulldozers had to remain parked on the public street and could not touch a single brick of the historic building. Connor scoffed, waving them off, claiming his high-priced lawyers would squash my little trespassing report in an hour and have the machines running before sunset. As Elijah and I drove away, I watched the rearview mirror. Keeping my eyes on the shrinking figure of my brother-in-law standing on the sidewalk, I saw Connor pull out his phone, his chest puffing out again as he dialed a number. He was calling his shady shadow investors, the dangerous men who had lent him the $3 million to pay my father. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was bragging to them that the police were just a minor hiccup and that the demolition was officially starting today. He was selling them the illusion of progress, telling them the property was totally secured, and that he needed them to wire the next multi-million-dollar tranche of funding immediately to keep the construction schedule moving. Connor was digging his own grave, deeper with every single word he spoke over that phone, feeding dangerous lies to loan sharks who do not forgive and certainly do not forget. He felt like the undisputed king of Atlanta, utterly blind to the fact that the trespassing report I just filed was the exact legal evidence my attorneys needed to prove his intent to defraud, and his borrowed empire was about to collapse directly on top of his head after leaving Connor and his idling bulldozers to bake in the Atlanta heat. Elijah and I drove straight to my corporate headquarters. My company occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek glass high-rise in Midtown, a far cry from the struggling student aesthetic my family thought I maintained. Walking through the double glass doors, the quiet hum of servers and the low murmur of my development team working in their glass-walled pods felt like stepping back into reality, into a world where I was in control. Not the discarded scapegoat of the Richards family, I headed straight for the secure conference room, known as the Vault. Elijah followed closely behind, dialing his firm to mobilize his investigative team. We needed to know exactly where Connor got that $3 million. The math had never added up for me. Connor flashed his wealth on Instagram, flexing rented supercars and leased penthouses. But his actual investment firm was a ghost town of shell companies and failed crypto ventures. Traditional banks do not just wire $3 million in liquid cash to a glorified day trader based on a single piece of forged real estate paperwork. There was something else backing that money, something far more volatile. I sat down at the head of the polished oak table and brought up the secure financial tracking software my team had developed for high-risk asset management. I gave the green light to my lead forensic analyst, a brilliant guy named Marcus, to start tearing apart the digital footprint of the wire transfer my father received. It did not take long for the layers of Connor's deception to start peeling away like rotten wallpaper. Marcus projected the financial flow onto the massive wall screen. The initial $3 million wire had not originated from a reputable Atlanta bank or even a legitimate private equity fund. It had bounced through a labyrinth of offshore holding companies in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg before finally landing in a domestic LLC registered in Delaware. The name of the company was generic Apex Holdings, but the names associated with its board of directors were anything but. Elijah let out a low whistle as he recognized a few of the names scrolling past the screen. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the table, and explained that Apex Holdings was a notorious front for a very specific type of lender. They were not a bank. They were a shadow syndicate operating on the fringes of the legal financial system. They catered to desperate developers and high-risk gamblers who needed massive amounts of untraceable cash, immediately the kind of cash that traditional institutions would never touch. Elijah clarified that these were essentially high-tech loan sharks operating with mafia. Adjacent tactics. They did not care about credit scores or business plans. They cared about hard collateral, and they demanded exorbitant interest rates paid on time. Every time without exception. Marcus pulled up the collateral agreement tied to the $3 million loan. The screen refreshed, displaying a scanned copy of the document. My stomach twisted slightly as I recognized the description of the collateral. It was my building. Connor had not just borrowed $3 million. He had used the forged deed my father signed as the absolute guarantee for the loan. He had promised the Shadow Syndicate that he owned a prime piece of historic downtown Atlanta real estate, and he had leveraged it to secure the cash. He then wired directly to my father. Connor had essentially handed over the rights to my inheritance to a group of ruthless criminals who expected either a massive return on investment or the deed to the property itself. The implications of what we were looking at were staggering. Connor had built a house of cards on a foundation of pure fraud. He had taken money from men who do not sue for breach of contract. They send enforcers to break kneecaps and disappear. People who default on their debts. Connor was betting his literal life on the assumption that he could demolish my building, build his luxury condos, and flip them fast enough to pay off the syndicate before they realized the collateral he gave them was completely worthless. The fake contract my father signed was the only thing standing between Connor and absolute ruin. And because of the irrevocable trust Elijah and I had established, that contract was a ghost. Elijah paced the length of the conference room, running a hand over his jaw. He summarized the catastrophic reality of the situation. My father, Reginald, in his arrogant greed to maintain his country club lifestyle, had not just stolen my inheritance and sold it out from under me. He had unwittingly defrauded a dangerous criminal syndicate. Connor, thinking he was the smartest guy in the room, had played the middleman, facilitating a multi-million-dollar theft, using mafia money for a piece of paper that had no legal standing. My family had unknowingly waded into extremely deep and dangerous waters, and they were celebrating their supposed victory while the sharks were already circling. I stared at the screen, watching the digital web of transactions connecting my father, Connor, and the Shadow Syndicate. The sheer stupidity of their actions was almost difficult to comprehend. They were so obsessed with status, so desperate to maintain the illusion of wealth, that they had blindly entered into a transaction that could destroy them all. I realized in that moment that I did not even need to fight them in court. The syndicate would do the heavy lifting for me if Connor could not develop the land, which he could not, because I legally owned it, and if my father had already spent the $3 million, which I knew he was currently doing. The syndicate would come collecting, and they would not be asking nicely. I looked at Elijah, the cold clarity returning to my mind, replacing any lingering shock with sharp strategic focus. I told him that we needed to monitor the syndicate's movements and keep a close eye on Connor. I knew the clock was ticking. The moment the syndicate realized the demolition had stalled, they would start asking questions. Connor would panic and try to squeeze the money back out of my father. But the money would be gone. My father had not just stolen from me. He had stolen from monsters, and he had no idea the storm that was about to hit. His perfectly manicured suburban life. I leaned back in my chair, tapping my pen against the table. The game had escalated far beyond a simple family dispute over real estate. It was now a matter of survival for them and a masterclass in karma for me. The days that followed were a masterclass in the sheer destructive power of unearned wealth. My security team tracked the financial hemorrhage of the $3 million in real time. It was almost morbidly fascinating to watch how quickly my parents could burn through a fortune they did not actually possess. Reginald and Valerie behaved as though they had struck oil in their suburban backyard, completely oblivious to the shadow syndicate breathing down the neck of their precious son-in-law. Within the first 48 hours, my father marched into the most exclusive country club in Buckhead and paid for an elite platinum-tier upgrade in liquid cash. He dropped hundreds of thousands of dollars just to secure his name on a brass plaque near the 18th hole. He traded in his leased vehicle for a custom-imported sports car, parking it aggressively at the front of the club to ensure every single one of his associates saw his supposed triumph. My mother Valerie was equally reckless. She swept through the luxury boutiques of Phipps Plaza like a hurricane, buying diamond tennis bracelets and custom-tailored gowns that she wore to simple afternoon luncheons just to make the other society wives stare. They even hired contractors to begin a massive unpermitted renovation on their estate, pouring money into marble fountains and imported fixtures. They threw lavish, spontaneous dinner parties, hiring private chefs and pouring bottles of vintage champagne that cost more than my first car. They showered Jasmine with gifts, funding her failing cosmetic brand to keep up the illusion of a family empire. They were intoxicated by their own delusions of grandeur, parading around Atlanta as the ultimate black elite power couple. They thought the $3 million was an endless magical fountain of wealth they had cleverly extracted from their ungrateful daughter. They had no concept of capital gains taxes, no understanding of sustainable investment, and absolutely zero awareness that the money currently funding their designer lifestyle was technically stolen from a dangerous criminal enterprise. I watched it all unfold from a safe distance, gathering every receipt, every social media post, and every public boast as ammunition for the inevitable collapse. The peak of their absolute detachment from reality occurred at the annual Spring Charity Luncheon, a highly publicized event hosted by the most prominent women in Atlanta high society. I attended the event quietly sitting at a table near the back, obscured by the towering floral arrangements. I was dressed modestly, blending into the background while my mother commanded the center of the room. She was wearing a blindingly bright sapphire necklace that I knew for a fact was purchased with the fraudulent wire transfer. She stood holding a crystal glass of sparkling water surrounded by her elite sorority sisters and the influential mothers of her social circle, soaking up their attention like a sponge. I sat perfectly still and listened as her voice carried across the room, designed specifically to be heard by as many people as possible. One of the women asked about me, asking how the quiet older daughter was doing these days. My mother let out a theatrical sigh, placing a perfectly manicured hand over her heart. She told the women that it had been such a difficult burden to bear. She spun a fabricated tale claiming that I had fallen into massive debt from a failed, embarrassing business venture. She lied through her teeth, telling the captive audience that she and Reginald had been forced to step in and bail their oldest daughter out of a catastrophic financial ruin just to keep me from living on the streets. She shook her head sadly, saying that some children simply lack the drive and intelligence to succeed in the real world, and that thank goodness they had Jasmine and Connor to carry the family legacy forward. The other women murmured their sympathies, praising my mother for her endless grace and maternal sacrifice. They called her a saint for putting up with such a burdensome child. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the warm liquid slide down my throat, while the irony of her words settled heavily in the air. She was standing there dripping in jewels paid for by mafia money stolen through a forged document, trying to sell the narrative that she was my savior. She was using my manufactured failure to elevate her own status, feeding her ego with the pity of her wealthy friends. She had always done this, rewriting history to make herself the hero and me the fragile, incompetent scapegoat. But listening to her tell these lies, while actively spending the loan shark money that was going to destroy her husband, was a level of poetic justice I could have never orchestrated on my own. I remembered the days I ate plain rice in my tiny dorm room because they refused to co-sign my student loans, and now she was playing the charitable matriarch. I did not interrupt her, I did not stand up and shout the truth. I just sat there and let her weave the noose tighter around her own neck. The luncheon reached its climax when my father, Reginald, made a surprise appearance striding into the ballroom with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he owned the entire city. He walked straight to my mother's table, kissing her cheek and ordering the waitstaff to bring their most expensive bottles of wine for the ladies. He took the microphone from the charity organizer, smiling broadly at the sea of wealthy socialites and powerful businessmen. He thanked his beautiful wife for her dedication to the community, and then he puffed out his chest, preparing to deliver his grand announcement. He told the crowd that the family empire was expanding faster than ever before. He proudly declared that his tireless work in commercial real estate had finally been recognized by the highest authorities in the city. His voice echoed through the grand hall as he announced that he would be receiving the prestigious Investor of the Year award at the upcoming Atlanta Winter Gala. The crowd erupted into polite applause, but Reginald was not finished. He raised his hand to quiet them down, stating that none of this unprecedented success would have been possible without his lucrative new partnership with his genius son-in-law Connor. He called Connor a visionary and the true future of their family wealth. I set my teacup down on the saucer, the quiet clink lost in the applause. My father was publicly tying his name, his reputation, and his most prestigious award directly to a man who was currently dodging calls from organized crime syndicates. The Winter Gala was going to be the social event of the season, and Reginald was setting the stage for it to become the most spectacular public ruin in Atlanta history. While my family was busy treating Atlanta like their personal playground, Connor was quietly sweating bullets. The Shadow Syndicate was not known for their patience, and the daily interest on his $3 million loan was compounding at a rate that would make a Wall Street banker gag. He needed legitimate capital, and he needed it yesterday. He could not stall the demolition forever, and he certainly could not develop a luxury condominium complex with the few $100,000 he had left in his failing crypto accounts. His only way out was to secure a massive traditional construction loan, pay off the syndicate with the initial disbursement, and then figure out the rest of the project. Later, it was a classic robbing Peter to pay Paul scenario, but Connor was desperate enough to think he could pull it off. My security team flagged his movements immediately. Connor had walked into the premier commercial lending branch of Southern Fidelity Bank, right in the heart of Midtown Atlanta, carrying a briefcase full of glossy renderings and a financial portfolio that was more fiction than fact. He was asking for a $10 million construction loan using the historic building my grandparents built as the sole collateral. He sat across from a senior loan officer, flashing his expensive watch and talking up his supposed real estate acumen, completely unaware that he had just walked directly into the belly of the beast. What Connor and my family did not know was the true scope of my fintech empire. My company did not just build apps. We built the proprietary risk assessment and asset verification software used by over 60% of the major financial institutions in the Southeast, including Southern Fidelity Bank. When a commercial loan officer at that bank inputs a property address into their system to verify ownership and assess collateral risk, the data request routes directly through my secure servers before returning a verdict. Connor had essentially handed his fraudulent application straight to me. I was sitting in the vault with Elijah and Marcus when the alert pinged on our central dashboard. An automated query had been generated by Southern Fidelity Bank for the exact parcel of land tied to my irrevocable trust. Marcus brought the application up on the screen, and we watched in real time as the banking software began its automated cross-referencing. Connor had submitted the forged contract signed by my father, presenting it as a legitimate transfer of deed. He had inflated his personal assets and lied about the zoning timeline. But the most critical piece of the puzzle was the property itself. Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished oak table. He told me that legally the bank would usually approve a loan of that size pending a final title search, but because Connor was pushing for an expedited disbursement to cover his syndicate debts, he was hoping the preliminary software check would clear him for a massive line of credit. Elijah looked at me, his eyes sharp and professional, and asked if I wanted him to draft a formal legal objection to the bank. I shook my head, keeping my eyes locked on the glowing digital application. I told Elijah, we did not need to send a single email. We just needed to let the software do exactly what it was designed to do: protect financial institutions from fraudulent assets. I turned to Marcus and gave him the authorization to manually update the property status in our central database. It was not illegal. It was not a hack. It was simply ensuring that the banking software had the most accurate, up-to-the-minute, legal information available. I watched as Marcus typed in the command, attaching the verified county clerk records of the irrevocable trust to the property parcel within seconds. The digital status of the historic building changed from clear title to a glowing red warning label that read disputed asset, under active trust review, ownership contested. Almost instantly, the automated approval process at Southern Fidelity Bank slammed to a halt. The screen flashed showing that the loan officer had received a hard stop notification. The software algorithms recognizing the severe legal risk of a contested property automatically froze the $10 million application. Connor was sitting in that plush leather chair, expecting a handshake and a champagne toast, and instead he was just informed that his collateral was legally toxic and his massive loan was suspended indefinitely pending a full legal investigation by the bank fraud department. The fallout was instantaneous. My team tapped into the peripheral communication channels, monitoring the digital panic radiating from the bank. Connor stormed out of the Midtown branch, his face flushed purple with rage and pure, unadulterated terror. He had banked his entire survival on that $10 million loan. He thought he could outsmart the system, use my father's arrogance to secure the land and use the bank's money to pay off the monsters breathing down his neck. Instead, he had just walked into a brick wall. Less than an hour later, while Connor was sitting in his parked car, desperately trying to figure out how his foolproof plan had collapsed, his cell phone rang. My team could not hear the audio of the call, but the metadata tracking showed the incoming number. It was a burner phone routing through an encrypted server tied directly to Apex Holdings. The Shadow Syndicate had noticed the delay. They had seen the stalled demolition, the lack of permits, and now the frozen bank loan, and they were not calling to ask about his day. Elijah watched the tracking data, his expression grim. He told me that loan sharks of that caliber do not care about trust disputes or family drama. They care about their money, and when their collateral is suddenly flagged as disputed, they assume they are being scammed. Elijah confirmed what I already knew. Connor had just been handed an ultimatum. The syndicate had given him exactly 72 hours. They demanded the cleared original deed to the property or the immediate return of their $3 million, plus an exorbitant penalty fee. If Connor failed to produce either, the syndicate would not take him to court. They would take him apart, piece by piece. The timer had started ticking and Connor was officially out of options, out of money, and completely out of time. While Connor was drowning in a rapidly shrinking window of time, trying to figure out how to satisfy the dangerous shadow lenders breathing down his neck. My mother was busy orchestrating her own social spectacle, completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb her son-in-law had strapped to their entire family. The Atlanta Winter Gala was only days away, and Valerie was in her absolute element. She was determined to make sure every single detail of their public triumph was flawlessly executed, and that included managing her biggest perceived liability, which was me. I was sitting at the massive marble island in my luxury penthouse, reviewing the latest highly classified quarterly projections for my fintech company, when the private concierge for my building buzzed the secure line to announce a special delivery. A courier had just dropped off a large flat box, wrapped in a garish gold ribbon bearing the logo of a mid-tier suburban department store. It was definitely not the kind of package that usually made its way past the strict security desk of my residence. I authorized the delivery, and moments later, a staff member brought it up to my floor, placing it carefully on the entryway table. I walked over and pulled the ribbon loose, opening the cardboard lid to find a dress. Inside it was a stiff, scratchy polyester gown in a dull, lifeless shade of mauve. a dress that practically screamed afterthought. Resting on top of the cheap synthetic fabric was a heavy cream-colored envelope. I pulled out the card inside, instantly recognizing the sweeping, pretentious calligraphy of my mother. The note was brief-cutting and entirely devoid of any actual maternal warmth. She wrote that she had taken the liberty of purchasing something appropriate for me to wear to the upcoming gala. She explicitly instructed me to try to look presentable and added a sharp warning, telling me not to embarrass my father on his big night. She reminded me that the absolute cream of Atlanta high society would be watching, and that I needed to blend in quietly at the back of the room while Reginald received his highly publicized Investor of the Year award. I stood in my expansive living room, looking down at the bargain bin dress, and felt a deep wave of profound pity. My mother was currently dripping in expensive diamonds purchased with stolen mafia money. She was throwing lavish catered parties funded by a fraudulent land sale that was about to get her golden son-in-law severely injured. Or worse yet, she still found the time and the petty energy to try and humiliate me by sending a garment that was specifically designed to make me feel small and insignificant. I did not feel hurt or insulted. I just saw the pathetic nature of a woman whose entire existence was built on a fragile, crumbling illusion. I picked up the dress by the plastic hanger, walked over to the kitchen and dropped it directly into the trash can without a second thought. Elijah stepped out of his home office, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, and saw the discarded box sitting on the counter. I told him about the note, and we both shared a quiet, knowing look. We were not going to blend in. And we certainly were not going to wear cheap polyester. We had been preparing for this specific night for weeks, and our actual wardrobe had already been secured. We were not dressing for a simple family dinner. We were dressing for war. My executive team had quietly flown in, a master tailor from Paris the week before, for private fittings in the penthouse. I was going to wear a custom haute couture gown, crafted from deep emerald silk that moved like liquid, a dress that cost significantly more than the luxury sports cars my father was currently leasing to impress his country club friends. Elijah had a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo tailored to absolute perfection, exuding the kind of generational wealth and quiet, unshakable power that my family spent their entire lives desperately pretending to possess. We were going to walk into that grand ballroom and effortlessly shatter every single lie they had ever told about me. As Elijah and I were finalizing the security logistics for the evening, my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the counter. The caller ID showed my father's number. He had not bothered to call me since the night at the restaurant. When he threw that $50,000 check at my face, I let it ring a few times, letting the tension build before answering. Keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of any emotion, Reginald did not bother with a standard greeting. He launched immediately into a demanding, authoritative lecture. He told me that he expected me to be at my assigned seat at the gala exactly on time. He said the press and prominent city officials would be there, and he needed his entire family present to project the image of a unified, highly successful dynasty. He spoke to me as if I were an unruly employee who needed to be brought to heel. He told me that after everything he had done to secure the financial future of the family by taking the heavy burden of that old downtown building off my hands, the absolute least I could do was show up and clap for the family that raised me. He wanted his designated scapegoat sitting front and center to witness his grand triumph. He wanted me to sit in the shadows in the cheap dress my mother sent and applaud obediently while he accepted an award for being a visionary real estate investor. He was so drunk on his own fake success, so completely insulated by his own overwhelming arrogance, that he could not hear the steel trap snapping shut around his ankles. He bragged to me over the phone that Connor was finalizing a massive $10 million construction loan that very afternoon, and that the family empire was utterly unstoppable now. I listened to him boast about a loan application I had personally frozen hours ago and an empire built on stolen land and borrowed mafia cash. I pictured Connor sweating in his car, terrified for his life, while my father confidently measured the drapes for his new country club locker. The sheer disconnect between their imagined reality and the actual mortal danger they were in was breathtaking. I did not interrupt his monologue. I did not correct his ridiculous delusions. I just let him talk until he finally ran out of breath and demanded to know if I understood his strict instructions for the evening. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse at the sprawling, beautiful Atlanta skyline, the very city I had quietly conquered while they were busy playing dress-up. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the cold anticipation settle perfectly in my chest. I told him in a voice as smooth and sharp as a polished blade, "Oh, I will be there. Dad, I would not miss your crowning moment for the world." The sun began to set over the Atlanta skyline, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and gold. But Connor was not admiring the view. He was pacing the marble lobby of his ultra-luxury Buckhead apartment building, sweating profusely through the collar of a designer dress shirt that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His phone was pressed hard against his ear as he desperately tried to get his contact at Southern Fidelity Bank on the line, for the 14th time that day. The bank was still giving him the exact same automated response. The $10 million loan application was suspended. The historic property was flagged as disputed, and no funds would be disbursed until a full legal investigation was concluded. Connor felt his stomach twist into a cold, hard knot. He had spent the last 3 days trying to convince himself it was just a software glitch, a minor clerical error that his expensive lawyers could swat away with a single phone call, but every lawyer he contacted told him the same terrifying thing. The title was locked up tight in an irrevocable trust, and the paper my father signed was essentially worthless. Connor shoved his phone into his pocket and turned toward the private elevator banks, his hands shaking so badly he could barely retrieve his key fob from his pocket. He just needed to get upstairs, pour himself a stiff drink, and figure out how to squeeze the original deed out of my father before the night was over. But before he could even take a step toward the elevator, 2 massive figures stepped out from the shadows of the decorative indoor palm trees blocking his path. They were dressed in immaculately tailored dark suits, but they did not look like businessmen. They moved with a quiet, predatory grace that instantly sucked the oxygen out of the lobby. One of them stepped forward, blocking the elevator doors, while the other stepped directly into the personal space of Connor, forcing him to back up against a polished stone pillar. The taller of the 2 men did not smile. He did not introduce himself. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, tapping it gently against the chest of Connor. The man spoke in a voice so quiet and utterly devoid of emotion that it made the hairs on the back of the neck of Connor stand straight up. He told Connor that the board of directors at Apex Holdings was growing incredibly impatient. He explained that they had lent out $3 million in good faith based on the absolute guarantee that Connor possessed the clear and undisputed deed to the downtown property. The man leaned in closer, the faint smell of peppermint and cold leather washing over Connor. He whispered that Apex Holdings did not deal in software glitches, and they certainly did not deal in family real estate disputes. They dealt in hard assets, and they expected their collateral to be clean. Connor tried to stammer out an excuse, his voice cracking as he promised that the paperwork was just delayed and that his father-in-law was going to hand over the official title tonight. The second man finally spoke, telling Connor that excuses were for people who used banks. They told him he had exactly until midnight tonight to produce the physical, verified, and legally binding deed to the property. If the clock struck midnight and the deed was not in their hands, the interest rate on the $3 million would immediately convert to a physical penalty. They promised Connor that they would start breaking bones, starting with his hands and working their way up until every single penny was accounted for. The 2 men turned and walked out of the glass lobby doors, disappearing into the Atlanta twilight, as if they had never been there. Connor slumped against the stone pillar, gasping for air, his legs suddenly entirely too weak to support his weight. He scrambled into the elevator, hitting the button for his penthouse floor with a trembling finger the moment the doors opened into his apartment. He bypassed his wife Jasmine, who was sitting at her vanity mirror complaining loudly about her hair extensions, and bolted straight for his private office. He locked the heavy wooden door behind him, drowning out the sound of Jasmine knocking on the wood and asking if he liked her gala dress. He pulled out his phone, his hands slick with cold sweat. He dialed the number of my father, Reginald, praying that the arrogant old man had the actual deed sitting in a safe somewhere ready to be handed over. Reginald answered on the fourth ring, the sounds of classical music and clinking crystal echoing in the background. My father did not even let Connor speak before he started barking orders, telling Connor that he and Jasmine needed to hurry up and get dressed because the limousine was arriving in less than an hour to take them to the winter gala. Connor cut him off, his voice shrill and borderline hysterical, begging my father to listen. He told Reginald that the bank loan was completely frozen and that the men he borrowed the initial $3 million from were threatening to kill him if he did not hand over the original title by midnight. Connor pleaded with Reginald to go into his safe and bring the official property documents to the gala so he could hand them over to the syndicate and save his life. My father let out an irritated sigh through the phone, completely dismissing the raw terror in the voice of his son-in-law. Reginald told Connor to calm down and stop acting like a paranoid child. He insisted that the contract they signed at the restaurant was legally binding and that Connor was just letting the pressure of real business get to his head. Reginald scoffed, telling Connor that he was not bringing any legal documents to a black tie charity event. He told him that tonight was about the family, celebrating his crowning achievement as Investor of the Year, and he absolutely forbid Connor from ruining his perfect evening with irrational anxiety. Reginald ordered Connor to put on his tuxedo, pour himself a drink, and show up to the ballroom, ready to smile for the cameras before hanging up the phone without waiting for a response. Connor stood alone in his dark office, listening to the dial tone echoing in his ear, the horrifying realization slowly washing over his panicked mind. He looked down at his shaking hands, the hands the syndicate men had promised to crush before midnight, and the truth finally clicked into place. Reginald had been too eager to sell, too quick to accept the wire transfer, and completely unwilling to provide the original deed. Connor realized with absolute certainty that his father-in-law might have just scammed him out of $3 million, giving him a worthless piece of paper while taking the mafia cash to fund his own country club lifestyle. Connor was completely trapped. His options had evaporated. He had no money, no property, and a massive target on his back. He knew he had only one desperate move left. He had to put on his tuxedo, get in the limousine, and attend the winter gala. He had to corner Reginald in that ballroom tonight and physically force him to hand over whatever documents he possessed, or he was not going to survive to see tomorrow morning. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Plaza Hotel was ablaze with the blinding flashes of paparazzi cameras and the warm glow of massive crystal chandeliers. Black SUVs and stretched limousines lined the circular driveway, depositing the absolute elite of Georgia high society onto the plush crimson carpet. Right at the center of the media circus stood my father Reginald and my mother Valerie, basking in the blinding glow of their fraudulent success. Reginald wore a velvet tuxedo jacket that he had undoubtedly purchased with the mafia money he stole from my inheritance. He held a crystal flute of champagne in one hand and waved to the local business reporters with the other, posing as the conquering hero of the real estate world. Valerie was draped in the heavy diamond jewelry she had bought during her reckless shopping spree, smiling a practiced plastic smile for the society photographers. She looked exactly like the wealthy, untouchable matriarch she had always pretended to be, completely unaware that her entire world was balancing on the edge of a very steep cliff. A few moments later, a hired black town car pulled up to the curb, and my sister Jasmine stepped out, wearing a heavily sequined designer gown that sparkled under the harsh camera lights. She immediately began posing, twisting her body to ensure the photographers captured her best angles. She was totally absorbed in her own vanity, completely ignoring the man walking beside her. The illusion of their perfect power couple aesthetic shattered the moment Connor climbed out of the vehicle behind her. Connor did not look like a triumphant cryptocurrency investor or a brilliant real estate developer tonight. He looked physically ill. His skin had a terrible gray pallor, and thick sweat beaded on his forehead despite the crisp winter air blowing through downtown Atlanta. His eyes darted around the crowded sidewalk, searching the deep shadows beyond the velvet ropes, terrified that the ruthless men from the Shadow Syndicate were already waiting for him in the parking garage. He kept tugging nervously at the tight collar of his expensive tuxedo, struggling to draw breath as his midnight deadline loomed closer and closer. Jasmine hissed at him under her breath, telling him to stop fidgeting and smile for the cameras, but Connor could barely force his trembling lips upward. He was a dead man walking, and he knew he had only a few desperate hours to corner my father in that ballroom and secure the official deed to my property before his legs were broken. As my parents continued to hold court at the top of the marble stairs, a sudden heavy hush fell over the crowded valet line. The low, powerful rumble of a custom-armored Maybach cut through the ambient noise of the crowd, demanding absolute attention from everyone present. The vehicle was a matte black Fortress, gliding smoothly to a halt right at the very front of the red carpet where only the most prestigious guests were permitted to stop. The paparazzi immediately sensed the dramatic shift in the atmosphere, turning their heavy lenses away from my father and aiming them directly at the dark-tinted windows of the massive Maybach. The private driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Elijah stepped onto the carpet first, looking like absolute royalty in his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. His presence radiated an intimidating calm that made the security guards stand up straighter. He offered his hand, and I stepped out of the vehicle, letting the heavy emerald silk of my custom Parisian haute couture gown cascade beautifully over the red carpet. The cameras erupted in an absolute frenzy of blinding white flashes. The press corps went wild, shouting questions and scrambling over each other to get a clear shot of the mysterious billionaire tech CEO who had single-handedly sponsored the entire Winter Gala. We did not stop to pose or wave for their cameras. We simply walked forward with quiet, untouchable authority, moving through the sea of flashing lights like we owned the entire city and everyone in it. Valerie saw me approaching, and her practiced smile instantly melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury and deep confusion. She abandoned her prime spot next to Reginald and marched aggressively down the wide marble stairs, pushing past a local news crew to intentionally block my path. She looked me up and down, her eyes taking in the heavy emerald silk gown, the flawless tailoring of Elijah, and the armored Maybach idling at the curb. Her face flushed a dark, angry red as she demanded to know what I was doing there. She asked if I had rented that expensive car just to show off and demanded to know who had paid for my custom dress. She hissed at me through clenched teeth, accusing me of making a ridiculous spectacle of myself and trying to ruin the most important night of my father's life. She ordered me to go around to the back service entrance and wait quietly at the assigned table she had picked out for me in the darkest corner of the ballroom, far away from the important guests. I did not even break my stride or acknowledge her desperate anger. I looked at the frantic face of my mother and let out a soft, chilling laugh that made her freeze in her tracks. I told her to step aside. I did not wait for her to move or give her another second of my time. I easily bypassed her, reaching into my elegant clutch and pulling out a solid titanium VVIP diamond badge. I flashed the heavy metal badge directly to the heavily armed security guards guarding the golden doors of the venue. The guards saw the diamond insignia and immediately unhooked the thick velvet rope without a single question. They bowed their heads respectfully, parting the way wide for Elijah and me to enter the grand ballroom. I walked inside the luxurious venue without looking back, leaving my mother completely stranded behind the velvet rope, staring at my retreating back in absolute horrified silence. The doors to the grand ballroom swung shut behind us, sealing out the frantic energy of the red carpet and welcoming us into a world of absolute opulence. The room was a masterpiece of floral arrangements and cascading crystal, with thousands of candles casting a warm, golden glow over the absolute elite of Atlanta high society. Elijah gently guided me to our seats, which were not tucked away in some dark corner like my mother had desperately wanted. Instead, The event organizers immediately ushered us to the absolute center of the room, to the premier diamond tier VIP table, directly in front of the main stage. The table was cordoned off with its own subtle security detail and covered in imported white orchids. I sat down, smoothing the heavy emerald silk of my gown, and watched as the rest of my family finally trickled into the ballroom. Valerie looked completely unhinged, her eyes darting wildly around the room until she spotted me sitting in the seat of honor. Her mouth dropped open, but the social constraints of the elite crowd forced her to swallow her rage and take her assigned seat far behind me. Jasmine and Connor sat beside her. Connor was actively trembling now, his eyes glued to the exits, his hands shaking so badly he knocked over his water glass. He was a man entirely consumed by the ticking clock of his mafia debt, completely unable to enjoy the lavish spectacle unfolding around him. The lights in the massive ballroom slowly dimmed, signaling the start of the evening program. A hush fell over the wealthy crowd as the master of ceremonies stepped up to the podium to announce the highly anticipated Investor of the Year award. He spoke of vision and unparalleled business acumen, paving the way for my father to make his grand entrance. Reginald stood up from his table, buttoning his velvet tuxedo jacket with an air of supreme arrogance. He practically floated up the carpeted stairs to the stage, soaking in the thunderous applause from the hundreds of society elites and business moguls who had no idea they were clapping for a fraud. He stepped up to the microphone, gripping the sides of the podium and looking out over the sea of faces with a sickeningly smug smile. My father cleared his throat and launched into a pompous, narcissistic monologue that he had clearly practiced in the mirror for weeks. He spoke at length about the grueling sacrifices required to build generational wealth and the heavy burden of carrying a real estate empire on his shoulders. He talked about legacy and the importance of keeping wealth within the bloodline. Then he proudly gestured down to his table, pointing directly at Connor, who looked like he was about to pass out. Reginald praised his son-in-law, calling him a brilliant financial mind and the absolute future of the family empire. He credited Connor with securing their newest multi-million-dollar commercial expansion, completely oblivious to the fact that Connor had funded that expansion with shadow syndicate money that was currently threatening to end his life. Reginald basked in the polite applause of the crowd, his ego inflating to the size of the ballroom. But Reginald could never just take a victory. He always had to twist the knife. He looked out into the dimly lit audience and his eyes scanned the tables until they landed squarely on me, sitting in the center of the room. A cruel, mocking smile spread across his face, and he leaned closer to the microphone. He lowered his voice, taking on a tone of fake paternal sorrow, and made a highly pointed, passive-aggressive joke. He told the crowd that building an empire is difficult because, unfortunately, not everyone in the bloodline is built for success. He chuckled darkly, saying that while some children understand the profound value of family loyalty and hard work, others stray from the path entirely, becoming cautionary tales of rebellion and utter failure. He shook his head, looking right at me, and added that parents can only do so much for children who refuse to apply themselves. The wealthy elite in the room let out a soft, polite ripple of laughter, completely unaware of the dark, bitter irony of his words. My father stood there thinking he had just publicly humiliated his scapegoat daughter in front of the entire city. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I just kept my eyes locked on his, holding a calm and utterly chilling gaze as he finished his self-righteous speech. The crowd applauded once more as the mayor of Atlanta, a highly respected and powerful figure, walked onto the stage carrying the heavy crystal trophy. Reginald turned to the mayor, extending his hands with a greedy smile, fully expecting to be handed the physical symbol of his ultimate triumph. But the mayor did not hand him the award. Instead, the mayor stepped up to the microphone and looked out over the sprawling ballroom, completely ignoring the outstretched hands of my father. The mayor adjusted his stance and announced that he was going entirely off script. The room fell dead silent, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The mayor stated, his voice booming through the massive speakers, that before they could hand out any individual awards tonight, the city needed to pay its deepest respects to the true architect of the evening. He revealed to the shocked audience that the entire winter gala, every single chandelier, every floral arrangement, and every catered plate had been single-handedly sponsored by an anonymous benefactor who had finally decided to reveal her identity tonight. My father lowered his hands, his smug smile faltering as confusion washed over his face. But the mayor was not finished. He raised his voice, letting the magnitude of his next words ring through the silent hall. He announced that this visionary female leader and her company had just signed a contract committing a staggering $50 million to completely overhaul the technology infrastructure of the city of Atlanta. The entire ballroom gasped in collective shock. $50 million was a number that commanded absolute terrifying respect, even in a room full of millionaires. My father stood frozen on the stage, suddenly looking very small and entirely out of place. The mayor smiled broadly and asked the crowd to direct their attention to the center of the room to honor the woman who was quietly changing the future of their great city. The technical crew in the balcony hit the switch. The massive, brilliant stage spotlight violently swung away from Reginald, plunging my father into absolute darkness on the stage. The blinding white beam of light sliced through the cavernous ballroom and landed directly on my VIP table, illuminating me and Elijah in a brilliant halo for the entire world to see. The gasps from the surrounding tables were audible over the soft background music, as every single face in the room turned to look at the woman my father had just called a complete failure. I sat bathed in the intense bright light, the heavy emerald silk of my custom gown shimmering brilliantly. I slowly raised my glass of sparkling water, looking directly through the beam of light toward the dark stage where my father stood completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own destruction. The blinding beam of the spotlight held me in its brilliant embrace as the mayor of Atlanta leaned back into the microphone, his voice echoing through the stunned silence of the grand ballroom. He formally introduced me to the highest echelons of Georgia society, not as the daughter of the man standing foolishly in the dark, but as the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Financial Technologies. He proudly announced that my enterprise, a company I had built entirely from the ground up, without a single cent of outside family money, had just completed its latest funding round, bringing its total market valuation to well over $200 million. He praised my relentless work ethic and my brilliant vision for the future of digital banking, painting a picture of a self-made titan that stood in direct, stark contrast to the pampered, arrogant image my family tried to project. The collective gasp that ripped through the ballroom was an actual physical sound, a sharp intake of breath from hundreds of the most powerful and wealthy individuals in the city who suddenly realized they were sitting in the presence of absolute unshakable power. I lowered my glass of sparkling water, letting my eyes drift from the darkened stage to the table where my family sat. The absolute devastation painted across their faces was a masterpiece that no amount of money could ever buy. Valerie, my mother, who had spent her entire evening trying to shove me into the shadows and humiliate me with cheap polyester, looked as though all the blood had been violently drained from her body. Her heavily diamond-draped neck was flushed a mottled red, and she was gripping the edge of the tablecloth so hard her knuckles were stark white. Her perfect socialite facade had completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but raw, unadulterated shock. Jasmine sat beside her, looking like her entire reality had just fractured into a million unrecoverable pieces. The golden child, who had built her entire identity on being superior to her older sister, sat there with her mouth hanging open, her false superiority shattered in an instant when she realized her failing cosmetic brand was nothing compared to a $200 million fintech empire. Up on the main stage, my father Reginald was entirely forgotten. The mayor had politely stepped away from the podium, leaving Reginald standing alone in the shadows, clutching a meaningless crystal trophy that suddenly felt like a heavy, worthless rock in his hands. He tried to open his mouth to speak into the microphone, to claim that my success was built on the foundation of his excellent upbringing, but the sound technician had already cut his audio feed. He was literally muted, silenced by the very city he thought he owned. He tried to step forward to regain the attention of the room, to somehow attach his name to my astronomical success, by smiling and pretending this was all part of his grand parenting plan, but nobody was looking at him. The investors, the real estate moguls, and the society elites, who had been clapping for him just moments ago, physically turned their backs on the stage. They abandoned their catered tables, ignoring the rest of the awards ceremony entirely, and began to swarm toward my highly secured diamond-tier VIP table. They formed a massive moving crowd eager to shake my hand to introduce themselves and to beg for a fraction of my attention or a sliver of my newly announced $50 million city infrastructure contract. Elijah stood up smoothly, intercepting the most aggressive networkers with a calm professional smile, ensuring that I remained comfortably seated and protected from the crushing wave of society elites rushing to pay their respects. I sat there receiving business cards from men and women who had previously looked right through me. Men who had played golf with my father for decades were now practically shoving each other out of the way to praise my absolute genius. It was the ultimate display of high society hypocrisy, and I soaked in every single second of it, knowing that Reginald was watching his entire network of powerful friends grovel at the feet of the daughter he had just publicly called a failure. He was completely ostracized in real time, reduced to a forgotten man standing on a dark stage, while his scapegoat child conquered the entire room without even breaking a sweat. But while the room was busy worshiping at the altar of my success, Connor was experiencing an entirely different kind of revelation. My brother-in-law was still sitting at the family table, his face glistening with a cold, terrified sweat. The name of my company, Apex Financial Technologies, was ringing in his ears over and over again, playing on a loop of pure horror. It was the exact same name he had seen printed on the bottom of the digital rejection notice at Southern Fidelity Bank earlier that afternoon. The gears in his desperate, panicked mind finally clicked into place. The massive $10 million construction loan, the sudden digital freeze, the contested property flag that had stopped his mafia bailout dead in its tracks. It was not a computer glitch, and it was not a coincidence. It was me. He remembered the smug way he had waved that forged piece of paper in my face at the demolition site, thinking he had outsmarted a naive college dropout. He realized that every single move he made since wiring that $3 million to my father had been perfectly anticipated and countered. Connor realized with absolute horrifying certainty that the woman sitting in the center of the ballroom, commanding a $200 million empire and controlling the banking software of the entire city, was the exact same woman whose inheritance he had just tried to steal. He realized that I had the power to freeze his assets, track his movements, and completely obliterate his fake real estate deal with a single keystroke. The raw terror in his eyes morphed into a violent, desperate rage. He knew his midnight deadline with the Shadow Syndicate was only hours away, and the person holding the key to his survival had orchestrated his destruction from the very beginning, and was currently sitting 30 feet away, surrounded by bodyguards. Connor violently shoved his chair back, knocking a crystal wine glass onto the floor, where it shattered into jagged pieces. He ignored the startled cries of my mother and sister pushing his way aggressively through the dense crowd of high society elites. His eyes locked dead onto my table, his fists clenched as he charged straight toward me. Connor was practically foaming at the mouth as he barreled through the sea of silk and diamonds. His eyes were wide and frantic, fixated entirely on me as I sat perfectly still at my diamond-tier table. The high society guests gasped and parted ways out of sheer shock, not used to seeing such a vulgar display of raw panic in their elegant ballrooms, before Connor could even get within 10 feet of me. Elijah moved with a fluid, terrifying speed. He stepped smoothly in front of my table, raising a single hand. The elite security detail assigned to our table immediately converged. flanking Connor on both sides, grabbing him by the arms before he could cause a physical altercation and ruin the most important night of my professional life. Elijah spoke in a low, calm voice that cut right through the heavy breathing of my brother-in-law. He told the guards to escort Connor and the rest of the family into a private soundproof VIP lounge, just off the main ballroom corridor. He made it clear that we were not going to let a temper tantrum disrupt the mayor and the rest of the gala attendees. My father Reginald and my mother Valerie followed closely behind, their faces flushed with a mixture of profound embarrassment and overwhelming greed. Jasmine trailed after them, looking completely lost, her designer gown rustling softly as the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP lounge clicked shut behind us, sealing us away from the music and the admiring eyes of the Atlanta elite. The private lounge was opulent, lined with dark leather couches and walls upholstered in thick acoustic fabric that absorbed every sound the moment the doors were locked. Connor completely lost whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. He broke free from the grip of the security guards and lunged toward where I was standing next to Elijah. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, screaming so loudly that his voice cracked. He yelled that I had frozen his loan at Southern Fidelity Bank, that I had used my company's software to flag the property, and that I had set him up from the very beginning. He was hyperventilating, pacing the thick carpet like a trapped animal, accusing me of orchestrating his entire downfall. My father, Reginald, did not seem to grasp the sheer mortal terror radiating from Connor. He was still completely blinded by the $200 million valuation the mayor had just announced on stage. Reginald straightened his velvet tuxedo jacket, attempting to regain his lost patriarchal authority. He looked at me not with an ounce of remorse for trying to steal my inheritance, but with a sickening, desperate hunger in his eyes. He told me that since I was hiding hundreds of millions of dollars, I had a strict moral obligation to give the family a substantial cut. He demanded that I write a check immediately to honor my parents and to compensate them for all the sacrifices they made raising me. Valerie nodded eagerly beside him, her diamond necklace sparkling under the recessed lighting. She chimed in, her voice dripping with fake maternal affection, claiming that family wealth should be shared and that I could easily bail them all out of their financial troubles with just a tiny fraction of my tech empire. I looked at the two of them standing there demanding a piece of a pie they had spent my entire life trying to destroy. A cold, genuine laugh bubbled up from my chest, filling the soundproof room. It was not a happy laugh. It was the sound of absolute disbelief at their bottomless entitlement. I took a slow step forward, making my parents physically flinch back. I told them they were completely delusional. I reminded them that just 24 hours ago, they had stolen the historic building. My grandfather left me. They had forged documents and sold my legacy behind my back, for pennies, to the idiot brother-in-law, currently having a panic attack. In the corner, I asked Reginald if he really thought he could commit a felony against his own daughter and then turn around and demand a multi-million-dollar reward for being a good father. I told them I owed them absolutely nothing. Not my money, not my respect, and certainly not my mercy. Jasmine stood frozen against the acoustic wall, finally realizing that the older sister she had spent her life mocking was now the untouchable kingmaker of the family. But Connor was no longer paying attention to my flawless takedown of my parents. The words forged, documents, and pennies echoed in his desperate mind, confirming his absolute worst nightmare. He realized that I was not going to unfreeze the bank loan, and I was certainly not going to bail him out. His midnight deadline, with the shadow syndicate, was breathing down his neck, and he had no money, no property, and no way out of the city. The primal instinct for survival completely overtook him. Connor pivoted away from me and turned his wild, frantic eyes toward Reginald. He let out a guttural scream that echoed off the leather walls. He lunged forward, grabbing my father by the lapels of his expensive velvet tuxedo, and slammed the older man hard against the heavy mahogany doors. Reginald let out a startled gasp, struggling uselessly against the frantic strength of his son-in-law. Valerie shrieked in horror, trying to pull them apart. But Connor ignored her completely. He shook my father violently, spitting the words directly into his face. Connor screamed that Reginald had promised him the deed was clear and undisputed. He demanded that Reginald hand over the official title right that exact second, his voice breaking into a terrified sob. Connor confessed to the entire room that the $3 million he wired my father did not belong to him. He screamed that he had borrowed it from dangerous people, and if he did not give them the deed by midnight, they were going to kill him. The heavy acoustic walls of the VIP lounge seemed to press inward, absorbing the frantic sounds of Connor gasping for air and my parents staring at him in absolute horrified disbelief. Connor was still pinning my father against the heavy mahogany doors, demanding the deed, screaming that the Shadow Syndicate was going to murder him before the night was over if he did not hand over the official title to the property. Reginald, the man who just minutes ago had been basking in the adoration of Atlanta high society, now looked like a deflated balloon. His face was devoid of color, and his hands shook as he tried to push his son-in-law away, stammering that he had already given Connor the contract and that the sale was final. Valerie was sobbing loudly, her carefully applied makeup ruined, completely oblivious to the actual legal catastrophe unfolding in front of her. Jasmine stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth, finally understanding that her husband's arrogant boasting had been built on a foundation of lethal borrowed money. I stood near the leather sofa, watching them tear each other apart. Elijah remained by my side, his stance relaxed but vigilant, ready to intervene if the violence escalated toward us. The panic in the room was palpable, a thick, suffocating cloud of consequences finally crashing down on people who had spent their entire lives avoiding them. I waited for the screaming to die down just enough for my voice to be heard clearly over their chaos. I did not shout, and I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my elegant emerald silk clutch, and my fingers brushed against the crisp, folded parchment I had been carrying all evening. I pulled out a single neatly folded document and walked over to the large smart TV mounted on the wall of the VIP lounge. With a few quick taps on my phone, I cast a high-resolution scan of the document directly onto the massive screen. The bright light of the television illuminated the darkened room, cutting through the panic. I told them to look at the screen. My voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that made even Connor stop screaming and turn his head. Reginald squinted at the glowing display, his chest heaving as he tried to read the dense legal text. Valerie stopped sobbing, her eyes darting between me and the screen. Jasmine took a hesitant step forward, reading the bold heading at the top of the document. It read Official Certificate of Irrevocable Trust. I stood beside the screen and began to explain the law to them slowly and meticulously, making sure every single devastating detail sank into their desperate minds. I pointed to the official county clerk's stamp glowing in the top right corner of the document. I told my father to look very closely at the date and the timestamp. I explained that 48 hours before he ever sat down with Connor to sign that fraudulent contract, 48 hours before he threw that pathetic $50,000 check in my face at the restaurant, I had already legally transferred the entire historic downtown property into this irrevocable trust. I told him that the trust was entirely in the name of my grandparents, and that I was the sole beneficiary and the absolute controlling trustee. Reginald stared at the timestamp, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. He finally croaked out that it was impossible, claiming that he had the power of attorney and that he had the legal right to sell the building. I let out a short, cold laugh that echoed off the leather walls. I told him that the power of attorney he was waving around was a relic from when I was 18 years old, and the absolute second this irrevocable trust was filed and stamped by the county, that old power of attorney became completely and legally dead. I explained that his signature on the contract he gave Connor meant absolutely nothing. The contract was a phantom document. It held no legal weight, no transfer of ownership, and absolutely no value in any court of law. I looked directly at Reginald and told him that he did not sell my building because he did not own it, and he never had the authority to sell it in the first place. The silence in the room was absolute. A terrifying quiet that signaled the complete collapse of their entire reality. Connor let go of the lapels of my father, slowly backing away from the door, his eyes fixed on the massive glowing document on the screen. His chest was heaving, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, as his mind desperately tried to process the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe he was standing in. He looked at me, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. He asked me if the contract was fake, and if the property was locked in the trust, then what had he just bought? I looked at Connor, feeling absolutely no pity for the man who had spent years mocking me and who had gladly participated in the theft of my inheritance. I let the cold, hard truth drop like a guillotine. I told him he had bought nothing. I told him that the $10 million bank loan was frozen because the banking software recognized the trust dispute instantly. I took a slow step toward him, making him flinch back. I lowered my voice, leaning in just enough to ensure he heard every single syllable. I looked Connor dead in the eyes and told him that he had just given my father $3 million of extremely dangerous mafia money for a piece of paper that was not even worth the ink it was printed on. Connor stood completely frozen for a fraction of a second as the absolute reality of my words crashed down on him, the sheer weight of his impending doom snapping the last fragile threads of his sanity. He let out a sound that was barely human, a raw, guttural roar of pure, animalistic panic that vibrated through the soundproof walls of the VIP lounge. He lunged forward, crossing the small space in a single violent stride, and slammed his hands directly into the chest of my father. The impact drove Reginald backward with a sickening thud against the heavy mahogany doors, knocking the breath out of the older man completely. Connor did not stop there. He grabbed the lapels of the velvet tuxedo, twisting the expensive dark fabric into his fists, and shook my father with a terrifying, desperate strength. He screamed at Reginald, his voice cracking and breaking under the immense pressure of his terror. He demanded that my father give him his money back. Right that very second, he ordered Reginald to pull out his phone log into his bank account and wire the $3 million back into the Apex Holdings shell company immediately before the shadow syndicate realized they had been played for absolute fools. Connor was practically sobbing as he shook the patriarch of the family, screaming that his life was literally on the line and that Reginald needed to fix the catastrophic mess he had created with his arrogant ignorance. Reginald was entirely unrecognizable. He was no longer the arrogant real estate mogul who had strutted onto the gala stage just minutes prior. He was just a terrified old man trapped in the violent grip of a son-in-law who was fighting for his actual life. Tears began to spill over the wrinkled cheeks of my father, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He raised his trembling hands, trying weakly to pry the fingers of Connor off his ruined tuxedo. But he had absolutely no strength left. The pompous facade had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw, pathetic desperation. My father began to weep openly, sobbing right there in the middle of the luxurious lounge. He shook his head back and forth, his voice a high-pitched whimper of absolute defeat. He confessed to the room, his words tumbling out in a rushed, panicked stream, that he did not have the money anymore. Connor froze, his eyes wide and bloodshot, demanding to know what Reginald meant by that. My father squeezed his eyes shut, unable to look at the violent terror in the face of his son-in-law, and admitted the horrifying truth. He told Connor that the $3 million was already gone. Reginald stammered out the pathetic details of their reckless spending spree. He cried that he had to pay off his own massive hidden debts just to keep the country club facade alive. He confessed that he had bought his new imported sports car in cash and paid for elite memberships to save his crumbling social standing. He pointed a trembling finger at my mother, who was standing frozen in horror, and choked out that Valerie had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy those massive diamond necklaces and custom gowns she was currently wearing. Reginald then turned his tear-filled eyes toward his golden child and revealed that he had dumped the rest of the stolen cash directly into the failing business accounts of Jasmine, using the mafia money to quietly pay off the massive debts of her pathetic luxury cosmetic brand. He sobbed uncontrollably, telling Connor that they had burned through the entire $3 million in less than 2 weeks and that the accounts were completely empty. The silence that followed his confession was the sound of a family entirely imploding upon itself, the perfect high society dynasty, completely tearing each other to shreds in a matter of seconds. Jasmine let out an ear-piercing shriek, stepping back from her father as if he were covered in venom. The golden child who had spent her entire life worshipping the ground her parents walked on, suddenly realized that their reckless vanity had just signed the death warrant of her husband. She lunged toward her parents, screaming at the top of her lungs that they had ruined her life. She cursed her father for his stupidity and screamed at her mother for wearing diamonds bought with money that was going to get Connor killed. She completely lost her mind, thrashing and wailing, pointing at the jewelry dripping from the neck of Valerie and demanding she take it off and sell it right this second. Valerie could not handle the absolute destruction of her reality, the sudden violent shift from being the queen of the Atlanta Winter Gala to a woman whose own daughter was screaming at her in a soundproof room was simply too much for her fragile ego to bear. Valerie began to hyperventilate, her hands clutching at her chest as she stumbled backward. She collapsed heavily onto the dark leather sofa, gasping for air. Her perfectly styled hair completely ruined her mascara, running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She was a broken, pathetic shell of a woman, completely overwhelmed by the catastrophic consequences of her own bottomless greed and the terrifying reality of what was about to happen to them all. I stood beside Elijah, watching the absolute carnage unfold before me. They were ripping each other apart with the very lies and manipulations they had used to build their fake empire. They did not need me to destroy them. They were doing it perfectly well, all by themselves. I felt absolutely no pity, no sadness, and no desire to intervene. The justice of the universe was playing out exactly as it should have, and my presence in that room was no longer required. I turned to Elijah, giving him a single nod, indicating that the show was officially over and it was time for us to leave this pathetic display behind us. We turned our backs on the screaming, weeping family, preparing to walk out of the mahogany doors and back into our own untouchable reality. But as my hand reached for the brass door handle, I heard a desperate scrambling sound behind me. Valerie had thrown herself off the leather sofa, her expensive heels slipping on the thick acoustic carpet. She crawled across the floor in her ruined designer gown, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her high society dignity. She lunged forward, grabbing handfuls of the heavy emerald silk of my custom dress, her fingers digging desperately into the fabric as she collapsed at my feet. My mother looked up at me, her face a twisted mask of terror and smeared makeup. Tears streaming down her cheeks, she begged me. Her voice, a pathetic, raspy whine, pleading with the daughter she had just publicly mocked to save them. She cried that I had $200 million, that I was the most powerful woman in the city, and that I could easily bail them out. She begged me to write a check to the Shadow Syndicate to use my vast tech empire to pay off the $3 million and save the life of Connor and the freedom of my father. She crawled at my feet, weeping and begging the scapegoat she created to be the ultimate savior of their ruined lives. I looked down at my mother sobbing on the floor of the soundproof lounge, her hands desperately clutching the heavy emerald silk of my custom gown as she begged me to save them from the catastrophic mess they had created for themselves. I felt absolutely nothing for the woman groveling at my feet. She was not crying because she regretted stealing my inheritance, or because she was sorry for decades of emotional abuse. She was only crying because she had finally been caught, and the consequences were currently staring her right in the face. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, forcing her hands to slip off my dress, and let the fabric fall perfectly back into place. I did not say a single word to her. I did not need to. Elijah reached out and grasped the heavy brass handle of the mahogany door, ready to lead us out of the suffocating room and leave my ruined family to wallow in their own destruction. But there was one final devastating detail that none of us in that private VIP lounge had realized yet. A detail so perfectly orchestrated by the universe that I could not have planned it better myself. During the violent physical altercation just minutes earlier, when Connor had shoved my father against the doors and grabbed him by the lapels of his velvet tuxedo, his frantic shaking hands had blindly swiped against the inner pocket of the jacket. In his desperate terror, Connor had accidentally hit the small transmission switch on the wireless lapel microphone that my father was still wearing from his keynote speech. The tiny red light on the audio transmitter had blinked back to life right in the middle of their catastrophic meltdown. While we were locked inside the supposedly soundproof room, every single frantic scream, every panicked confession, and every pathetic sob had bypassed the thick acoustic walls entirely. The live audio feed had routed directly through the primary soundboard of the grand ballroom, bypassing the muted background music and echoing out over the massive professional surround sound speakers. The audio technicians in the balcony had been too paralyzed by shock to cut the feed. The entire ballroom, packed with hundreds of the most powerful and wealthy individuals in Atlanta, had heard absolutely everything with horrifying crystal clarity. They had heard Connor screaming about borrowing $3 million from a shadow syndicate of dangerous loan sharks. They had heard his panicked demands for the official deed to the property, or the mafia was going to break his legs. They had heard the unmistakable sound of my father crying as he confessed to faking the real estate contract and stealing the inheritance of his own daughter. They had heard Reginald admit to spending the illegal mafia cash on country club memberships and imported sports cars just to keep up a fake wealthy facade. They had heard how Valerie used the stolen money to buy the very diamond necklaces she was currently wearing to the gala. The high society crowd had stood in the cavernous ballroom, listening to the glamorous, wealthy dynasty they had been applauding just 20 minutes ago, completely tear each other to shreds over fraud and stolen money. When Elijah pulled open the heavy mahogany doors and we stepped out of the VIP lounge, the scene waiting for us in the main ballroom was something out of a surreal, chilling nightmare. The gentle classical music from the string quartet had completely stopped. The soft clinking of crystal champagne glasses and the low hum of networking conversations had entirely ceased. The entire sprawling room was frozen in a dead, suffocating silence. Hundreds of eyes were locked directly on the doors of the VIP lounge, waiting for the architects of this massive scandal to emerge. I walked out first with Elijah by my side, my posture perfectly straight, my expression calm and untouchable. The crowd parted for us, immediately stepping back to create a wide, clear path through the center of the room. My parents stumbled out of the lounge a few seconds behind us, completely unaware of the public broadcast that had just ruined their lives. Valerie was still weeping loudly, her mascara-stained face looking around the ballroom for a sympathetic eye or a comforting friend. Reginald was trembling badly, adjusting his ruined tuxedo jacket and trying to muster a pathetic, tight-lipped smile to engage in some kind of desperate damage control. But there was no damage control left to perform in this city. The wealthy investors and real estate moguls who had just been drinking vintage wine with my father physically turned their backs to him as he passed. Reginald reached out a shaking hand toward one of his oldest business partners, a man he had golfed with for over a decade. But the man simply stepped away, shaking his head with a look of absolute disgust and refusing to even acknowledge the existence of my father. Reginald lowered his hand, the color draining from his face as he finally realized the entire room knew his darkest secrets. Valerie saw a group of women from her prestigious elite social club standing near the center tables. She let out a broken sob and staggered toward them, reaching out for the high society sisters she had spent decades trying to impress and emulate. The elite women in their designer gowns looked at her smeared makeup and her stolen diamond necklace with pure, unadulterated contempt. Without saying a single word, the women turned around in perfect unison and walked away, leaving my mother completely abandoned in the middle of the ballroom floor. She had built her entire identity on the approval of these superficial people, and in a matter of seconds she had been socially exiled in real time, completely erased from the elite circles she valued more than her own flesh and blood. Jasmine walked out of the lounge last looking like a hollow, empty shell. She stared at the judging, disgusted faces of the Atlanta elite and realized her reign as the untouchable golden child was permanently over. Her luxury brand, her social status, and her perfect marriage were all built on toxic lies that had just been broadcast to the entire city. But the final devastating blow of the evening did not come from the silent judging crowd. It came from the sudden piercing wail of heavy police sirens cutting through the cold night air outside the hotel venue. The flashing red and blue lights reflected wildly off the towering glass windows of the grand ballroom, signaling that the authorities were rapidly approaching the building. Connor heard the approaching sirens, and the last remaining shred of his fragile courage completely evaporated. He knew the Shadow Syndicate had likely tipped off the police to punish him, or perhaps the bank fraud department had finally dispatched the authorities for his forged $10 million loan application. Connor did not look at my father. He did not look at me, and he certainly did not look at Jasmine, the wife he had sworn to love and protect. The terrified crypto bro turned his back on all of us and broke into a dead sprint toward the service exit at the back of the ballroom. He shoved his way aggressively past a group of startled waiters knocking over a tray of champagne glasses as he bolted out the emergency doors. He disappeared into the dark Atlanta night, running for his life and leaving his weeping wife completely behind to face the absolute ruins of the empire he had helped destroy. 1 week had passed since the absolute destruction of my family at the Winter Gala, and the fallout had been swift and utterly merciless. Connor was a ghost. He had completely vanished into the wind, leaving his luxury leased cars, his empty penthouse, and his weeping wife. Entirely behind, my security team reported that the Shadow Syndicate had already seized his crypto wallets and were actively hunting him down, tearing through his associates to find the man who had lost their $3 million. Reginald was in an even worse position. The Federal Bureau of Investigation did not take kindly to arrogant real estate developers who forged documents and committed wire fraud across state lines. He was currently facing multiple federal indictments for selling a commercial property he did not own, and the bank fraud department at Southern Fidelity was preparing to bury him under a mountain of civil lawsuits that would ruin him 10 times over. I was sitting in my penthouse office with Elijah reviewing the final blueprints for the historic building renovation when the private elevator chimed unexpectedly. I had given strict orders to the lobby security team not to let anyone from my biological family up, under any circumstances, but sheer desperation makes people incredibly resourceful. Somehow my parents had slipped past the delivery entrance and managed to tailgate a wealthy resident up to my highly secure floor. The heavy oak doors of my office swung open without warning, and Reginald and Valerie stumbled inside, looking like they had just crawled out of a war zone. The sight of them was genuinely shocking. They looked absolutely nothing like the polished, arrogant, high society couple who had strutted down the red carpet in velvet and diamonds just 7 days ago. Reginald was wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like he had slept in it for a week, his face covered in patchy gray stubble, his eyes darting around my expansive penthouse with hollow, frantic terror. His hands shook uncontrollably at his sides. Valerie was a complete and total disaster. Her hair was unwashed and tied back in a messy, jagged knot, her face completely devoid of the expensive makeup she usually wore like a mask of superiority. The diamond necklaces were gone, likely pawned to pay for the retainer of whatever desperate criminal defense attorney they had managed to hire. They looked broken, completely stripped of the fake wealth and the toxic pride that had defined their entire miserable existence. My father did not even try to maintain his patriarchal authority. The moment he saw me sitting behind my massive desk, he practically collapsed onto his knees, his expensive leather shoes scuffing against my hardwood floor. He clutched the edge of the polished wood and began to beg, his voice cracking and breaking under the immense, crushing weight of his impending federal prison sentence. He pleaded with me to save him. He confessed that the Shadow Syndicate was now threatening to come after him and Valerie, since Connor had disappeared with their money and left them holding the bag. Reginald cried that the federal prosecutors were offering him a plea deal, but it still carried a minimum of 10 years in a maximum security facility, unless he could somehow make full restitution for the fraudulent wire transfer. He looked up at me with thick, heavy tears streaming down his face and begged me to buy the fake contract from Connor. He asked me to just wire $3 million to the syndicate to clear the debt and make the criminal charges disappear. He cried that it was the only way to keep him out of federal prison and save their lives. He promised he would pay me back. He promised he would work for the rest of his life to make it right, completely. Ignoring the fact that he was already a disgraced, ruined man, with absolutely no future left in the business world, I sat perfectly still, watching the pathetic display of the man who had spent my entire life telling me I was a massive failure. Valerie saw that I was not immediately reaching for my checkbook, and she launched into her own desperate manipulation tactics, unable to stop herself from using the same toxic guilt trips she had weaponized against me since childhood. She threw herself onto the floor next to Reginald, her hands grasping at the air as she wept, loudly echoing through the quiet luxury of my office. She screamed that they were my parents, that they had given me life and clothed me and put a roof over my head when I was a helpless child. She cried that the mayor had just announced to the entire city that I was worth over $200 million. Her voice grew shrill and demanding as she sobbed. That $3 million was absolutely nothing to me, she yelled. That it was just a tiny drop in the bucket of my massive tech empire, and that I could fix this entire nightmare with a single phone call to my bank. She wailed, asking how I could be so cold and heartless to my own flesh and blood. She begged me to have some mercy on the mother who had raised me, and the father who was about to spend the rest of his natural life locked behind thick iron bars, surrounded by dangerous men. They knelt on the floor of my luxury penthouse, weeping and begging for salvation from the very daughter they had tried to destroy and humiliate. They expected me to fold. They expected the deeply ingrained familial guilt to finally kick in and force me to open my vault to clean up their catastrophic mess, just like I was expected to pay for their lavish dinners and sit quietly in the shadows. Elijah stood quietly by the window, his arms crossed, watching me with absolute trust in whatever decision I was about to make. The heavy silence of the penthouse pressed down on the pathetic sobbing of my parents. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up from behind my desk. I looked down at the two broken people sobbing on my floor. The people who had sold my legacy for pennies and paraded around the city in diamonds bought with mafia cash. I stepped forward, moving away from the desk, my face completely void of any emotion, my heart beating with a steady, calm rhythm as I prepared to deliver my final verdict. I stared down at the two pathetic figures groveling on my hardwood floor, listening to their desperate pleas for mercy, masking their absolute lack of remorse. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or obligation toward them. They were simply strangers begging for a bailout from a woman they had spent 30 years trying to destroy. I took a slow, deliberate step toward them, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that instantly silenced their frantic weeping. I told them that mercy is a gift reserved exclusively for people who make honest mistakes. I explained that what they did was not a mistake. It was a meticulously calculated choice to steal my legacy, forge legal documents, and leave me with absolutely nothing while they paraded around Atlanta in diamonds and imported cars. I looked directly into the bloodshot eyes of Reginald and told him that he did not just sell a historic building to a glorified crypto scammer. He sold his fundamental right to ever call me his daughter again. Valerie let out a sharp, devastated wail, reaching her hands out to grab my ankles again, but I stepped back entirely out of her reach, looking down at her ruined designer dress with pure apathy. I told them that they had fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic of this situation from the very beginning. I was not a bank, and I was certainly not their savior. I reached over to my massive oak desk and pressed the silver intercom button, signaling the heavy security detail waiting just outside the penthouse doors. I informed my parents as the heavy doors swung open that they were entirely out of time. I told Reginald that the meeting he had scheduled with his expensive criminal defense attorney tomorrow morning was going to be a lot more complicated than he ever thought. I revealed that Elijah and I had already compiled every single piece of evidence: the forged signature, the digital timestamp of the irrevocable trust, the fraudulent bank loan application, and the tracking data for the shadow syndicate wire transfer. We had personally hand-delivered the entire comprehensive file directly to the district attorney and the Federal Bureau of Investigation hours ago. The security guards stepped into the office, grabbing my father by the arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. Reginald went completely limp, realizing the absolute totality of his defeat. Valerie scrambled backward, crying hysterically and clawing at the carpet as a female guard guided her firmly toward the private elevator. Reginald tried to shout something over his shoulder, a final desperate threat, or a pathetic plea for forgiveness. But the heavy steel elevator doors sealed shut, cutting him off completely and leaving my penthouse in absolute pristine silence. The toxic infection that had plagued my entire existence had finally been surgically removed, and the air in my office felt lighter and cleaner than it ever had before. The justice system moved with terrifying efficiency when handed a perfectly wrapped federal fraud case tied to organized crime money. Reginald was indicted on multiple felony counts of wire fraud, forgery, and criminal conspiracy. He tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the sheer scale of the stolen mafia money and the relentless media circus surrounding his spectacular high society downfall made leniency entirely impossible. My father was sentenced to 10 grueling years in a federal penitentiary, his exclusive country club memberships and tailored velvet tuxedos permanently replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and a cold concrete cell. Valerie lost absolutely everything to the asset forfeiture laws. The government seized the sprawling suburban estate, the offshore bank accounts, and every single piece of diamond jewelry she had hoarded to pay off the massive legal restitution. She was forced to move into a tiny, rundown one-bedroom apartment on the dangerous outskirts of the city. She was completely shunned by her elite sorority sisters and the high society women who now treated her like a contagious disease, actively turning their backs on her in the local grocery store aisles. Jasmine, the former golden child, was left entirely bankrupt and utterly alone. Connor remained a hunted ghost, likely buried under a mountain of violent debt or hiding in perpetual fear of the shadow syndicate, leaving his wife to face the absolute ruin of her luxury lifestyle brand. She had to take a minimum wage retail job, folding clothes at a discount mall, just to survive her perfect, arrogant facade, entirely shattered under the crushing weight of her new bleak reality. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air blew across the newly reinforced rooftop of the historic downtown building my grandparents had left me. The rhythmic sound of heavy construction equipment echoed from the lower floors as the massive architectural renovation project moved forward exactly on schedule. I stood near the edge of the roof, resting my hands on the secure brick parapet, looking out over the sprawling, glowing skyline of downtown Atlanta. The building was not going to be a sterile luxury condominium complex for the ultra-wealthy. It was being completely transformed into the Apex Innovation Hub, a state-of-the-art technology incubator heavily funded by my own fintech empire. It was designed specifically to provide millions of dollars in grants, mentorship, and resources to minority entrepreneurs who just needed someone to believe in their vision the way my grandparents had believed in mine. Elijah stepped up beside me, wrapping a warm, strong arm around my waist, pulling me close against the autumn chill. He looked out at the brilliant city lights and then down at the bustling construction site below, telling me that my grandparents would be unbelievably proud of the empire I had built from their foundation. I leaned my head against his shoulder, letting a deep, profound peace wash over my soul. I had faced the greedy monsters of my past, and I had not just survived their treachery. I had completely eradicated their toxic influence over my life. I had protected my family legacy. I had built my own untouchable empire. And for the first time in 30 years, I was finally unconditionally and absolutely free. The most powerful lesson from these stories is that your worth is never defined by the people who failed to see it. Blood does not automatically entitle anyone to your peace, your resources, or your presence. When toxic family members repeatedly choose their own pride over your well-being, walking away is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of profound self-respect. True family is built on mutual support and genuine love, not manipulation and conditional approval. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply removing their access to your life and building your own beautiful empire from the ashes of their rejection. If you have ever had to set hard boundaries to protect your own peace, share your experience in the comments below and hit subscribe for more stories of ultimate survival and success.